Harper's Ferry, Virginia, October 1859. John Brown, a deeply religious U.S. abolitionist, led a raid on this town, home to about 3,000 people. He was convinced that God wanted him to change the world by bringing an end to slavery in America. The point of this raid was, yes, to free slaves, but also to send a message. The raid was deadly. 17 people lost their lives, including one of Brown's own sons and the mayor of Harper's Ferry. But Brown felt justified in his actions, mainly because of his faith. And he had the loyalty of his followers who believed in what he was doing, including 2 of his sons. Brown was a symbol of hate to some, but a champion of freedom to others. Quote,
"I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no peace in this land until slavery is done for."
The incident only lasted a couple of days. Brown and his party were captured after the army arrived in town. He was tried, sentenced, and executed. People of slaveholding states were furious. Mississippi Congressman Reuben Davis remarked that the raid was reason enough to leave the United States. Quote,
"Even if it rushes us into a sea of blood."
At the time, people in non-slaveholding states regarded Brown as a martyr for the cause of liberty. Henry David Thoreau said of Brown, quote,
"He has a spark of divinity in him."
The divided opinions about John Brown were a reflection of the divisiveness of the institution of slavery. That divisiveness would pull the United States into a civil war only 18 months later. John Brown was regarded as a hero by some and a villain by others. So wait. Why are we, a sci-fi video essay channel on YouTube, discussing something that happened over 160 years ago? Well, because terrorism. Specifically, we want to talk about how the Star Trek franchise has discussed terrorism throughout its 50-plus-year run. It's no easy topic. And John Brown is an example that illustrates how much gray area there can be in that topic. Was Brown a terrorist? His pro-slavery opponents might have thought so, and modern historians have been debating it. But Brown himself would have flatly denied it. Is it the case that terrorism is simply in the eye of the beholder? We will see that Star Trek very much embraces this gray area, at least until it doesn't. But first, let's start with an attempt at a definition. There is no agreed-upon meaning for the word terrorism. The moral ambiguity of the actions that could be labeled terrorism also infects the word's very definition. Broadly speaking, though, terrorism is the use of violence or the threat of violence in the pursuit of political, religious, ideological, or social objectives. That's not vague, is it? Within the Star Trek multiverse, terrorism is a surprisingly frequent concern, and that's down to the fact that the franchise regularly discusses the areas that terrorism seeks to influence through violence: politics, religion, cultural norms. The franchise addresses terrorism in what we can label as 3 distinct phases, and the first phase starts earlier than you might think. In the original series, discussions of terrorism are almost non-existent. Terrorist-like behaviors can be seen, but the morality or causes of terrorism are never directly addressed. In one particular episode, The Cloud Minders, we see a planet, Ardana, where a dissident group born out of lower-class miners who live on the surface are in open rebellion against the planet's ruling elite, who literally live in the clouds, in a floating city called Stratos. While the dissident group, the Disruptors, could wear the title of terrorist easily, the episode doesn't focus in on that, but instead focuses in on the psychological ramifications of the wide gap of wealth inequality and class division on Ardana. It does manage to address the antagonism of the dissident group as a physiological effect of a gas emanating from the miners' work environment.
I see no changes in any of us.
Perhaps you need closer exposure.
So yeah, not a big conversation starter for our topic. The franchise's approach changed with the Next Generation episode The High Ground, which brings us to our second phase of the Star Trek conversation regarding terrorism. it is almost no surprise that Star Trek decided to approach the complex motivations for terrorism in the 1990s. The 90s were a fertile period for terrorism in the public imagination.
Continue now our coverage of the terror that has struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Police say that it may in fact have been a bomb, a massive bomb.
Bam, just a really loud noise, and then we saw people bleeding. There was steel hitting people, and we were rushing people to medical.
More than 40 people were hurt, and one man was killed. It may have done more than £1 billion worth of damage.
These acts of terrorist violence are abhorrent, they are inhuman.
Explosivo, suficiente anfo y dinamita para volar la fachada de su objetivo, las oficinas de Luz del Sur en Santa Anita.
At the center of it all, of course, is the bombed-out shell of the federal office building, and in its shadow, the exhausted, who for a day and a half now have sifted through its debris and counted its dead and seen up close why they call it terror.
In the high ground, the Enterprise visits a planet called Rudia 4, where we learn very quickly that the dominant Rudian society is dealing with a separatist group called the Ansata, led by the charismatic Kirill Finn.
If you need anything, ask for me. My name is Kirill Finn.
In the opening scene, Ansata terrorists kidnap Dr. Crusher in an attempt to drag the Federation into the Ansata struggle for freedom. With the Ansata's leader, Finn, we meet a terrorist, openly, face to face.
I always wondered what it would be like to travel across the galaxy. It's not something I've exactly had time for. This isn't the best way to meet new people, is it?
The episode toys with painting Finn as a sympathetic character. This is revealed mostly through conversations between Finn and Dr. Crusher.
You should be drawing, not killing people.
I can do both.
How can you have such a casual attitude toward killing?
I take my killing very seriously, Doctor.
The complex gray area surrounding terrorism is very much the topic of the episode. For example, this episode criticizes, with some deliberation, the effect of real-life U.S. foreign policy on people around the real world. During the course of the episode's events, Finn addresses Picard about his concern over the Federation's involvement in his world's affairs.
Federation has a lot to admire in it. But there's a hint of moral cowardice in your dealings with non-aligned planets. You're doing business with a government that is crushing us, and you say you're not involved. You're very, very much involved. You just don't want to get dirty.
Also, the idea that terrorists can be seen as freedom fighters is up front and center in this episode, when Finn describes himself as being like George Washington.
Washington was a military general, not a terrorist.
The difference between generals and terrorists, Doctor, is only the difference between winners and losers. You win, you're called a general. You lose...
You are killing innocent people.
In the high ground, the Starfleet characters, and by extension the audience, can see both sides of this conflict, even if they have a problem reconciling the differences between the two. They look down on terrorism and sympathize with it and condemn it, all with the same haughty attitude. This complicated perspective is on display specifically in this scene, which prevented this episode from being broadcast in the British Isles. The scene directly references the then-contemporary Northern Ireland conflict and encapsulates what becomes the defining perspective in this second phase of the conversation about terrorism in Star Trek.
I've been reviewing the history of armed rebellion, and it appears that terrorism is an effective way to promote political change.
Yes, it can be. But I have never subscribed to the theory that political power flows from the barrel of a gun.
Yet there are numerous examples when it was successful. The independence of the Mexican state from Spain, the Irish unification of 2024, and the Kenzie Rebellion.
Yes, I'm aware of them.
Then would it be accurate to say that terrorism is acceptable when all options for peaceful settlement have been foreclosed?
With the high ground, we start that conversation by wading directly into gray, murky waters. But just how much murkier are those waters going to get? How much more sympathetic can Star Trek be to terroristic actions? Grab your bathing suit, friends. We're going in deep.
History has shown us that strength may be useless when faced with terrorism.
If the goal of the high ground was to introduce a complicated perspective by forcing Starfleet characters to see that a terrorist can be both villain and hero, then the next goal of this second phase was to make that complication more personal. And this happened in two simultaneous but related narrative prongs that spanned The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. The first prong is developed when we are introduced to the conflict between the Cardassians and the Bajorans, and we are given a recurring lens through which to view that conflict. Ensign Ro Laren, a new member of the Enterprise crew and a troubled survivor of Cardassia's brutal occupation of the Bajoran homeworld.
Ensign Ro Laren reporting as ordered, Commander.
Ro Laren is a character we are meant to sympathize with, and through her, we are taught to view Cardassian actions in a negative light.
I serve the Federation, but I am Bajoran. A Starfleet admiral presented me with an opportunity to help my people in their fight against the Cardassians. I had to accept.
Indeed, the main story of the episode in which Ro Laren first appears deals with Bajoran terrorists. Bajorans, we discover, resorted to what Cardassians would describe as terrorism in order to rid themselves of their conquerors. Unlike the characters who make a single appearance in the alien planet of the week in The High Ground, Ro Laren is a permanent addition to the show, a permanent Starfleet character who takes a side in Trek's grade discussion on terrorism.
This used to be me.
The Ensign Ro episode is, in fact, a complex story of how states and terrorism intertwine, and which may have even been commentary on real-world U.S. foreign policy. But we'll come back to that in a moment, because the second related prong of this more personal approach to terrorism demands our immediate attention. That is, the role of the Maquis.
Don't you understand? These are desperate people ready to martyr themselves. They don't want to talk.
Accessing file.
The Maquis was a terrorist organization / group of freedom fighters born out of expansionist tensions between the Federation and the Cardassian Empire. Citizens of the two intergalactic states settled close to each other, sometimes in neighboring star systems, in a region of space disputed by both powers. After a series of skirmishes and a war between those two powers in the 2350s and 60s, a truce was reached and then a treaty was signed. The treaty created a demilitarized zone between them, or DMZ, and banned military bases and warship excursions into the disputed region. But it also drew an official border, which ceded territory on both sides. Some Federation citizens ended up in Cardassian territory, and some Cardassians ended up in the Federation. Those Federation citizens who were moved to Cardassian space by bureaucrats light years away from the border developed a powerful grievance, and their grievance turned into an independence movement, which resisted both Cardassia and the Federation.
The Cardassians intend to make life so unpleasant for Federation citizens that they'll leave.
Exactly. And no one seems to see that. Except the Maquis.
A number of Maquis episodes peppered throughout The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager chronicle the rise and fall of the Maquis as the organization leading this independence movement. And throughout those episodes, characters other than Ensign Ro are personally invested in actions that could be considered terrorism, and their perspectives help to further villainize the Cardassians and create sympathy for those who resist through violent means. Miles O'Brien, a non-terrorist character, for example, was affected by fighting in the Cardassian War, and in an episode of DS9 shows that he can understand Maquis motivations.
They should be hunted down and destroyed.
What for? Defending their homes? Look at what's happened to those people. One day they're eking out a living in some godforsaken colonies in the Cardassian border. The next day, the Federation makes a treaty handing those colonies over to the Cardassians. What would you do?
I would not become a terrorist. It would be dishonorable.
I wouldn't say that around Major Kira if I were you.
In The Next Generation, a Starfleet captain named Benjamin Maxwell, who has held a grudge against Cardassians for years, uses his position to preemptively strike Cardassian weapons hoarded along the border.
Peace treaty was a ruse to give them breathing room, time to regroup.
And so all alone, you decided to dispose of the treaty.
I took the initiative. I did what had to be done.
Calvin Hudson, a personal friend of Benjamin Sisko, trades in his Starfleet career to become a leader in the Maquis resistance.
I thought these colonists wanted to stay, that they refused to evacuate.
The treaty gave away their territory to the Cardassians. Territory that these people had invested their lives in. Now, Ben, if you knew them as I do, you'd know why they can't leave. It's a bad treaty.
A long list of other characters from both DS9 and Voyager. William Samuels, Sakona, Thomas Riker, the transporter clone of William Riker, Chakotay, B'Elanna Torres, Lon Suter, Tom Paris, many Federation citizens and Starfleet officers choose to fight with the Maquis. And eventually, in the Next Generation episode of Preemptive Strike, Ro Laren joins them too, motivated by her own traumas concerning Cardassia, thus briefly merging Trek's two-pronged approach on this topic into one.
Could you tell Captain Picard something for me?
Of course. What is it?
Tell him I'm sorry.
So long, Ro. Take care of yourself.
Goodbye, Will.
That messy gray area we saw open up with Chiral Fen and the Ansata separatist movement only becomes grayer as subsequent series and characters encounter similar moral ambiguities. The question of whether to commit a terrorist act is no longer abstract or a problem for a distant alien race. With the Maquis, terrorism is made intimate. Characters we regularly see on screen have to make a personal choice on the matter, bringing the audience along for the ride. We see this most pointedly with how Benjamin Sisko responds to the supposed freedom fighters. It isn't just his friend Calvin Hudson's turn to the Maquis that enrages him, but also that of a security officer that worked for him, Michael Eddington.
Open your eyes, Captain. Why is the Federation so obsessed with the Maquis? We've never harmed you, and yet we're constantly arrested and charged with terrorism. Starships chase us through the Badlands, and our supporters are harassed and ridiculed. Why? Because we've left the Federation, and that's the one thing you can't accept. Nobody leaves paradise. Everyone should want to be in the Federation. Hell, you even want the Cardassians to join. You know, in some ways, you're even worse than the Borg. At least they tell you about their plans for assimilation. You're more insidious. You assimilate people, and they don't even know it.
You know it, Mr. Eddington. I don't give a damn what you think of the Federation, the Maquis, or anything else. All I know is that you betrayed your oath, your duty, and me. And if it takes me the rest of my life, I will see you standing before a court-martial that'll break you and send you to a penal colony where you will spend the rest of your days growing old and wondering whether a ship full of replicators was really worth it.
Sisko resorts to desperate tactics in order to capture Eddington, going so far as to poison the atmosphere of a Class M world on which a Maquis colony is located.
Can't you see what's happening to you? You're going against everything you claim to believe in. And for what? To satisfy a personal vendetta?
You betrayed your uniform!
And you're betraying yours, right now! The sad part is you don't even realize it.
But even Sisko, who makes such great efforts to capture a supposed traitor, even he can understand the complex plight of the Maquis.
Out there, in the demilitarized zone, all the problems haven't been solved yet. Out there are no saints, just people. Angry, scared, determined people who are going to do whatever it takes to survive, whether it meets with the Federation approval or not.
Makes sense to me.
Clearly, the Maquis situation personally affects characters who come close to it, forcing them to choose sides. But forcing sympathetic characters to question their loyalties isn't the only way the franchise escalates this discussion. Consider, too, the colony on Dorvan 5, depicted in the Next Generation episode Journey's End. A group of American Indians, after searching for 200 years for just the right place to call home, settled on Dorvan 5, and they had been there only 20 years before the Enterprise shows up, tasked by the Federation with relocating them. As it turns out, Dorvan is one of the disputed planetary systems in the Federation Cardassian demilitarized zone. This episode plays particularly on real-world sympathy towards the forced relocations and genocides of many American Indian nations, a sympathy that dovetails neatly with the sentiment that the Maquis are only defending their homes. In a later series, Voyager, the character Chakotay is meant to be from a world like Dorvan 5, a Native American colony in the DMZ that joined the Maquis to defend itself from Cardassian incursions and Federation betrayal. In this, the franchise is making very sure that we can sympathize with the motivations behind Maquis terrorism and resistance. The Voyager series may begin with several Maquis characters forced to work together with Starfleet counterparts to survive in the Delta Quadrant, and the conflicts remain personal and intimate, but questions of terrorism are never so emotionally charged as they are with Ensign Ro and Benjamin Sisko. Voyager, in fact, seems to lose interest in the Maquis as a lens through which to explore violent resistance. For Voyager, which is about a ship lost on the other side of the galaxy, survival is understandably more important than a separatist movement 75,000 light-years away.
To him, and to Cardassians everywhere, I make the following pledge. By the time his birthday dawns, there will not be a single Klingon alive inside Cardassian territory, or a single Maquis colony left within our borders. Cardassia will be made whole.
Eventually, the Maquis, back home in the Alpha Quadrant, are completely defeated by Cardassia, with the help of their new powerful ally, the Dominion, in the run-up to the Dominion War.
Victory is life! Victory is life!
After this, the Maquis aren't heard from or seen again in the franchise. The demise of the Maquis allows us to return to the other narrative prong of this second phase of Trek's terrorism discussion, the profound tension between Cardassia and Bajor. Once Ro'Laren moves on from the franchise, the centerpiece of this prong becomes Kira Nerys.
The casual brutality of it. The waste of life. What kind of state tolerates the murder of innocent women and children? What kind of people give those orders?
Yeah, Damar, what kind of people give those orders?
That's why you're here, isn't it? To hang a few more Cardassian neck bones from your belt? Admit it, Kira. You won't be satisfied until every one of us is dead.
Oh, I don't have time for this.
Kira Nerys is a badass, and her badassery is a consequence of her life as a terrorist. I mean, freedom fighter.
You are throwing it all away. All of you.
You're being a fool!
Well then, don't ask my opinion next time. That is the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, and I resent the implication. This is one puppet who doesn't like her strings pulled.
That won't be necessary. I feel quite safe here.
No, it wasn't your safety that concerned me.
Major, get everything settled with Quark.
Oh, that little toad is this far from doing a 360 out an airlock.
I'm glad to hear everything went okay.
Well, let me put it another way. If I ever catch you pointing a hollow imager at me again, you will end up eating it.
It's hard to keep a secret in ops, especially when you've been shouting at a monitor for the last 2 days.
Thought I kept it down to an angry whisper.
That attitude of yours, Major, it won't be tolerated forever.
You don't like my attitude, Damar? You're welcome to try to change it. Let her go.
And if I don't? What happens then?
I was hoping you'd ask. If you don't take that hand off my hip, you'll never be able to raise a glass with it again.
The Cardassian occupation of Bajor affected Kira from a very young age. Her mother was conscripted into sexual slavery, and her father was murdered by Cardassian soldiers while defending his home. Her childhood was continually colored with violence and injustice. By the age of 12, Kira Nerys was a member of the Bajoran resistance. Her experience was not unique. Bajor suffered Kira's misery writ large. There were rapes, tortures, concentration and labor camps, strip mining, genocide, all planet-wide. Dozens and dozens of episodes explore what Bajorans were doing during the Cardassian occupation and how they suffered. Horror story after horror story intentionally uses the Bajoran fight for freedom to echo real-world resistance movements against the Nazis during World War II. Through her experiences, Kira represents a kind of culmination of the Phase 2 approach of intimately acquainting viewers with the murky gray waters of terrorism. Like Ro'Laren, Kira joined with those in power, the Cardassians, regarded as a terrorist organization, where she committed acts of violence in a fight for her people's freedom. However, unlike Rolaren, who was a secondary character who betrayed primary characters like Captain Picard, Kira Nerys is herself a primary character in Deep Space Nine. She is a member of the command crew, central to the show's ensemble nature. Inevitably, she brings her experience with violent resistance and her skepticism for Cardassians into the very heart of the series. Throughout Deep Space Nine, we get to know Kira and her battles, understand her reasoning and regrets. We see through her that the Cardassians are almost irredeemable. Because she is one of our entry points to the series, and because she is unfailingly badass, the audience becomes fully sympathetic with her, in spite of or even as a result of her terrorist past. Even more complicated is the fact that terror tactics don't fully remain a feature of Kira's past. Her terrorist skill set is called upon at multiple points in the present of the show. During the height of the Dominion War, for example, she travels to Cardassia to help instigate a native Cardassian resistance movement against the Dominion. She is able to forgive her former oppressors just enough to help them in their own quest for freedom. Many, many episodes of Deep Space Nine wrestle with who is and who isn't a terrorist, and the show continuously plays with the blurry line between immorality and justified resistance. Looked at through this lens, it's worth asking how the audience is ultimately meant to regard Kira. Is she a Bajoran George Washington? Or is she closer to more historically complex figures like John Brown? Or could it be that she really is as the Cardassians see her and the Bajoran resistance? A destroyer of the best of civilization. More like a Timothy McVeigh or even an Osama bin Laden.
How many Cardassians did you kill? I mean, personally.
I didn't keep count.
Oh, I think you did. And I'm sure your total wasn't limited to military personnel. After all, the most effective terrorist weapon was random violence. Don't leave now, Major. It's just getting good. How many Cardassian civilians did you kill?
Look, I regret a lot of what I had to do.
How convenient of you.
We had no choice. We were fighting for survival.
So were we. We had an empire to protect. We needed your resources. Everything I did was for the greater glory of Cardassia.
The way DS9 gives insight into Kira's life, it's hard to see her as fully evil. Watching her live her life, defend her home, fall in love, hang out with her friends, we see Kira as a complete person. Because of her sad, violent past, when we see Kira smile, we know she really feels it. It's very difficult to fully condemn her for her violent resistance when we have such a full picture of her life and can so easily sympathize with her people's fight for freedom. That sympathy is certainly no accident on the part of the show's writers. So, in what we're calling Phase 2, we've gone from appreciating the moral complications inherent to terrorism in the high ground, to having Starfleet characters choose a side through the Maquis storyline, to the apex of this phase in Kira Nerys, a permanent, central character who is a former, successful terrorist. And we haven't even discussed the types of resistance found in the Terran Imperial universe, also known as the Mirror Universe, which fits neatly into this grade discussion. If this sympathetic perspective on terrorism is a reaction to the real-world events of the 1990s, it could be that writers felt a comfortable distance from terrorism IRL, allowing them to peel back the moral layers of the subject. But Star Trek doesn't always manage to tackle the subject from such a calm and thoughtful distance. At least one real-world event completely changed how the franchise approached the concept of terrorism.
So you have no idea right now?
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh my God! Another plane has just hit. It hit another building.
To find out how that event changed Star Trek, be sure to check out our second half to this series, where the story takes a surprising turn. If you find any value in the topics being discussed here, in understanding where toxic fandom might come from, in how the Star Trek franchise talks about personhood or parenthood, or how it echoes ancient literature, in how science fiction connects with our modern lives, or how sci-fi films take a particular form, then consider supporting what we do here. Help us to create more Trekspertise. You can do so by visiting Patreon, which is the best way to support the channel. If you'd like to be notified when the next essay lands, then subscribe, turn on notifications, and especially sign up for our no-nonsense email list. The email list is the most efficient method. Again, you can find all the relevant links down in the subspace below. Thanks. See you in part 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2. 2
遠い将来を考えてみようよ。